Excuse me, I have the privilege of welcoming you all here. I'm so happy that you're here.
Carol, identify yourself for those who don't know.
Okay, yeah. My name is Carol Mankiti. My husband was Ephraim Mankiti, who owned the store. And when he passed away, my children and I said we're going to keep this store. We love it. So we're doing our best to try to keep it going, along with James. But I just welcome all of you, and I welcome all of you that are on Zoom. We have a wonderful reading tonight with some really poets who have known the store for quite a while. So, welcome.
Take a chair here. Down. Yeah. My name is Mark Pawlak, and I'll be reading second, but it's my honor. Well, first of all, I just want to thank the Grolier, Carol, the memory of Fiani, and James for organizing this event tonight. And it's my great pleasure to be reading with my friend DeWitt Henry, who really he attended a reading and talk I gave at MIT about four years ago or so from a draft of my memoir about Denise Levertov, and his enthusiasm for it really kind of spurred me on to, really put the whip to my buttocks and get this thing done. And so I thank you for that. Yeah. So we're here. So we're both essayists and memoirs tonight, which is kind of an unusual lineup for the Grolier, which mostly focuses on poetry. But you'll see there's poetic strands running through everything we do tonight. And DeWitt is going to read some as well. So DeWitt Henry was the founding editor of Ploughshares, one of the most prestigious magazines in the country, and served as its editor and director from its inception in 1971 to 1995. He has published a novel, 2 memoirs, a story collection, and several anthologies, as well as Sweet Marjoram, which I think is right here somewhere. There we go. Sweet Marjoram, which is a collection of essays and notes. And he's a Professor Emeritus professor at Emerson College, and serves as a contributing editor of both the Woven Tale Press, which is an online, and Solstice magazines, which are both online literary journalists. And he lives in Watertown. So without further ado, I'll invite DeWitt to come up and share his work with us.
I'm the warm-up.
Just remember, Bruce Springsteen used to be the warm-up.
Well, this is my new book, Mad Hat. In the trilogy of memoirs that finishes with my new book, Endings and Beginnings, there are a number of deaths, the factors, losses from my parents, and then, in my own turn, the deaths of my parents, gifted nephew, friends, my 2 older brothers. Let me start by sharing the ending paragraphs of an essay where my most recent grief is from my 34-year-old nephew, an emerging painter and sculptor who died of AIDS, and whose portraits inspired me. My sister, his mother, was devastated to lose him. 4 years after my nephew John died, I flew to Los Angeles to see my sister Judy for the 3rd time since our mother's funeral. She was 59, I was just turning 53. I knew from phone conversations that she had continued in John's place to collaborate with her daughter Lucia, and that Frida-Risi Dolls was now an established, thriving business. Also that she had dedicated herself for the past 2 years as a volunteer in a buddy relationship with a young girl, Jessica, who had been born with AIDS and who would die before much longer. She would be in her Pasadena cottage to greet me when I arrived, but told me the key would be in the mailbox. How strange to enter her intimate world, the shell of her living with the opening of that door. Paintings filled nearly every available portion of wall, foyer, living room, dining room, bedroom. Mostly the paintings were John's. Some original canvases I had seen in his San Francisco apartment, some I had only seen in slides, and now was startled by in full size and richness of color. Other paintings I recognized as my mother's and Judy's. John's sculptures, too, occupied every available surface. Nudes, primarily female, were everywhere. Papier-mâché stylized birds of John's hung on wires from the ceiling. Startling dolls peered from tables, corners, chairs, in size ranging from 12 inches high to some 36. A Don Quixote seated on a horse, Quixote's face resembling my brother Jack, stood before the fireplace. As I waited for Judy, I told her later, I didn't feel alone. The house and its art told her silence over time and told John's. The walls talked, the corners, every table, every square and cubic inch. John's art merged with my mother's, with Judy's, and with the dolls and sculptures that were Judy's and Lucia's. I felt as if death were no more than a continuum of absence in space and in time, like physical distances between the living. Judy had a meeting of her buddies' hospice group the next night and took me along. After John's death, his lover Bruce, who had infected him, attempted suicide by jumping off a roof, only to end up maimed. Judy had taken care of Bruce until his own death from AIDS. It seemed to me that out of her love for John, her mission was to immerse herself in the problems of the gay community, especially the AIDS community. Not to flinch, as her ex-husband had done, and turn away, but to immerse herself. And in the buddies' meeting this night, she tried to comfort another buddy, a librarian who had just been told by the social worker in front of us that her buddy girl had taken a turn for the worse. And that the doctor had told her, the social worker, in medical confidence, that the girl would die soon. The librarian had broken down in tears. The spare bedroom was cluttered with archives of John's work, as well as some incomplete mosaics and canvases of her own. Within the creation of the house and its shown art, there was a so-called studio, where an archive of all John's sketches, notebooks, letters, and other papers were stored in flat art drawers. Also, where unhung canvases of his leaned against one wall, and where the entire original of a series of lithographs was leaning on an easel. I put up a new panel each week. There were 2 mosaics messily in progress and abandoned on cluttered work tables. Of her own painting and sketching, the canvas prop on one of those tables that gripped me was indeed a self-portrait. I did that after John died, she said. It was stark, all brown and white, a face contemplating suicide, angry, empty, devastated, blank. The stunned, helpless, beyond howls and tears face of a Hiroshima survivor, a victim waiting for execution. There was a 9 or 12-inch doll on her dresser in front of her mirror, a mirror stuffed with snapshots of family and friends and her buddy Jessica, that I took for another self-portrait, though she said it was not. This was a life-worn woman, lifted young and shining, if those are the words, arched somehow, all alive, enthralled, as if in exaltation, out of her aging body and mortality, as if to greet the lost love found, the dead reborn. I felt proud of my sister, who seemed to know more about the mysteries of grief than anyone in my life, and who, for me, embodied the triumph of love. So after I retired from teaching 4 years ago, I began writing essays like poems on various topics such as weather, conscience, cursing, privilege, handshakes, and empathy. They moved from delight to wisdom by means of research, etymology, wit, memories, literary quotations, pop culture references, and free association. They were published by Manhattan and Sweet Marjoram. notes and essays. Since then, I've continued to meditate on abstract topics, but begun to write poems, like essays. These have appeared in plume on the seawall, Ibbotson Street, and generous elsewheres, and have resulted in my first collection, Restless for Words Poems, which will be published by Finishing Line Press a year from now. I'll read the title poem on ghosts, appropriate to Halloween, and 3 new ones. On ghosts. Ghosts haunt guilty dreams, Richards and Brutus's, though no one else can see other than the audience. Horatio speaks to the ghost on the battlement, yet only Hamlet hears its news, its call for revenge. Then in the closet scene, the ghost appears to be Hamlet's hallucination. "Whereunto you look?" his mother asks in Hamlet. "Do you see nothing there?" Banquo's ghost unmans Macbeth, prompting his outcry before guests. "Shake not thy gory locks at me!" in his lady's hushed rebuke. "You look but on a stool." The audience, of course, looks on actors, the lady a boy, props and stage, director's choice whether to show the ghost or not. Shakespeare's ghosts suit all, the critics argue. A skeptic, Catholic, or Protestant would each leave the globe with her or his idea of ghost confirmed. We're spooked by needing more to love than death. Horatio asks the ghost, "Why do you come back? To pass on clues? To bury treasure? To forewarn?" In James Agee's A Death in the Family, Jay's wife Mary is mourning with family when they all sense a presence, which she knows is his. "Stay near us all you can," she tells him. "The children are all right, my sweetheart, my husband. I'm going to be all right." Hallucination, the others think. Thought transference. Paranormal researchers call such visits crisis apparitions, theorizing they might be telepathic signals sent while dying, or perhaps produced unconsciously by mourners to console themselves. Others consider them guardian angels, sent to comfort the grieving, known as art proof. Psychics, swamis, fortune tellers, spiritualists, and voodooists abound. Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Ramsay, modeled on her mother, is still a unifying force 10 years after her death. Brings her scattered family together to resume their expedition to the lighthouse. If they shouted long enough, Mrs. Ramsay would return, thinks Ole Briscoe, a friend. Spooky. Spooked. Cartoons make the afterlife cute in Casper's case, though the friendly ghost died as a child. He interacts with mortals, floats around and passes through walls. He seeks playmates. Ghost in the Machine, a closed-circuit TV in the case of Elmer Ryder's Hamlet. From romance, we've got Bruce Rubin's Ghost, invoking wishful lore such as spirits learning to kick cans and borrow living bodies. Hence Whoopi Goldberg volunteers to be Patrick Swayze's way of kissing Demi Moore. Ghostbusters puts a team of parapsychologists against malevolent ghosts. Who you gonna call? Steven Spielberg's Poltergeist goes for horror instead of laughs. A greedy developer builds tract houses over a cemetery, stirring spirits to attack one unwitting family, reach through TV screens, animate toys, and abduct their youngest child. Pale as a ghost. You look as if you'd seen a ghost. Not a ghost of a chance. If he knew, he'd turn over in his grave. Halloween fun with fake blood and makeup. Sheets for costumes, decaying bodies. My neighbor's yard decorations, tombstone with hands reaching out of the ground. Philip Guston painted ghosts as convivial Klansmen, hard-drinking, burger-chomping, chain-smoking, free behind masks to trade opinions about life. Ghosts of the past, the burden of tradition, great works, great lives precede us. Shoulders to stand on. My father's spirit is within me, or my mother's, or both, still fighting. Spirits of absent ones live in my heart, and mine and theirs to comfort and inspire. I did hear voices once alone during a long run in the Sierras. Mother, father, brothers, nephew, friends, all gone. Keep going, nature said. Do your best. Young Hamlet, one mission accomplished, forever haunts Horatio, restless for words, which is the title of my book. On this and on that, I take it as a fairly standard Montaigne kind of way of dealing with abstract. This is on faces. At 50th reunion, I searched strange faces for recognition. Familiar features slowly rise. Is it you? Me? Are you in there? Friendly? Name to face, face to name. As noun, surface, aspect, front. As verb, confront, affront. Face to face, about face. Make a face, disgust or joy. Two-face, baby-faced Nelson. See past and future, Janet's face. Funny, stretched mouth, red ball nose, oval eyes, expressive Varan. Poker face, deadpan, barefaced. Can't keep a straight one? Actors need many. My sculptor nephew's series of plastic masks, inspired by ancient Greek performers' masks and those the Japanese know, have hung on my sister's wall since his death. My favorite wears mirrored sunglasses. Another, fingers knit, covers its eyes like the first monkey. A third yawns with hippo mouth, echoed in nostrils, eyes half lidded. A fourth has yellowed, hollowed eyes, mouth pursed and set, while cracks spread across cheeks, nose, temples, and forehead, like earthquake rips. Face paint, war paint, faceless mob, pale, red, pandemic's PPI, nothing to read but eyes. On the face of things, effrontery, emojis, sketch art, mug book, yearbook, Facebook, face the music, Phantom of the Opera, Stephen Crane's The Monster, his face had been burned away. Half her jaw lost to cancer, and after years of failed restorations, Lucy Greeley learned to face up to her face. Face down others. Keep face. Perseus beheads Medusa with a blow directed by reflection in his shield and drops the head in a sack. Careful not to look or turn to stone. Look me in the face. Say that again to my face. Drone or bombs from 30,000 feet. The blind, or lovers in dark, trace hours with their fingertips. Lincoln closed his eyes while being greased with Vaseline, then bandaged with plaster-saturated gauze. Breathed through nostril holes until the plaster set. At Huntington Museum, accustomed to the photographs and paintings, I'm startled by his life mask on display. Creases, warts, eyebrows, and all. Life-size, intimate, 3D. And then another after death. Older, bearded, skin and mouth going slack. Facsimiles, likenesses. Children's fleeting as they grow. A plastic sculpture of my wife's age 9, an heirloom on our family shelves through child raising and grandparenting. Her father, before his moving out, had had her pose, his favorite of 4, sculpted from clay on armature, then cast. I recognize her now, heavy in my hands, beloved. Webster saw the skull beneath the skin. Here come the scary ones. SWAT teamers, robbers, Klansman, executioner, humanity obscured. Happy, happy, happy face. Though your face is charming, it's the wrong face. In masquerade, the familiar voice. This one is called Funky Robot. And it's in memory of James L. McPherson, who used to live above this store before he wrote the famous story Gold Coast. Can't tell a dancer from the dance. Why, there I am, rustier than the Tin Man, the game I'm trying. For my wife, daughter, guests, and granddaughters, I make jerky motions to the beat. This is called the Funky Robot, taught to me by James McPherson, author of Why I Love Country Dancing in Iowa, I say. At 10, I learned the box step at Mrs. Hill's School of Dance. Right hand open on her rounded back. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Glide, don't step. Her stale smell mixed with talc, and then with girls my age, taller than me, flat-chested. At make-out parties, we swayed, embracing, and at proms, our chaperones insisted on a gap. Rock and roll or crooners ballads. We studied TV's bandstand. In college, I never mastered jitterbug. In grad school, however, dances changed from twist to frug, to free-for-alls of soul. I never knew what craze was in. The locomotion, Watusi, mashed potato, monkey, shimmy, swim, or boogaloo. I evolved my own routine, swiveled my hips as if hula hooping, then snapped my fingers, did side steps. Party mates tried to follow. Oh, teach me that! Hey, look at this! I met Connie, a BU senior, at an older writer's party. We grooved at first dance. Living together, we swayed on creaking floorboards like slow dance, as I proposed and she accepted. Once married with children, however, we rarely danced as a couple. We had family occasions on her side, weddings, bar and bat mitzvahs. She had fundraising dances at the K-6 school where she taught. But besides having back problems, I felt reserved. My dancing days were done. She danced with other women while I watched. By the 80s, social dancing had become partnerless, a stone frenzy of aloneness together. We were child rearing, teaching with separate friends, hers local parents and colleagues, mine writers I admired, as I helped to start a literary magazine, which led to travel and editor gigs at the annual convention of the Associated Writing Programs, where, after 3 days of readings, panels, and a book fair, writers danced. Writers were hip and sensual. Except they tried too hard. Bodies less their element than words. Running was my dance. I thought marathon training along the river into Boston, rhythm of my heartbeat, race embodies pace. Ladies, dancers don't have periods, the woman dancer once wrote. But for runners, well, there's Uda Pepe, cresting Heartbreak Hill with blood on legs and mouthing, I can't, and going on to win. Do the huck-a-buck. If you don't know how to do it, well, you're out of luck. Besides the Tin Man's dance from The Wizard of Oz, McPherson was likely thinking of young Michael Jackson's robot dance during Jackson 5's performance of Dancing Machine in the 60s. He was also mocking the white stereotype of African Americans except for him, of African Americans having natural rhythm except for him. The square dance is the only dance form I ever mastered, he wrote. Supposedly jerky rather than supple, at least before AI, microchips, and MIT's robotics lab, robots couldn't jumper dance, even to electro-funk. True dancers, of course, train for artificial naturalness. Light on her feet. The illusion of ease depends on practice, exercise, and toil, as well as on such gifts as youth, litheness, stamina, and coordination. They ask, then grant their bodies to perform. Meanwhile, most of us, most of the time, carry ourselves as burdens, badly jointed, painful to watch, don't got rhythm, out of step, dreams confined within the body's cage. How much of marriage follows your steps, mine, or ours? How much needs to? When a friend, newly divorced and retired, got fixed up with the widow of a famous hoofer, their date didn't go well. Hard shoes to fill, he quipped. My oldest brother's widow sent me a list of things you never knew about her. Such as, while suffering from COPD, he took ballroom dance with his wife. My second brother, a doctor, visited my mother after she quit her life-preserving meds. They'd shared a last waltz until her heart monitor had fallen off, causing nurses to rush in, expecting the worst. Do we keep dancing because to stop would mean the extinction of everything we value? Or because there are still things to celebrate? Asks the Oedipus scholar, Claire Catanaccio, about the ancient tragic choruses. One last short one. This is called On Mirrors. My window, your reflection. One-way spies on privacy. Narcissus drowned in self-love. Magic's judge of beauty contest. Infants first wonder at her or his outside seen while inside lived. My right is left. Letters reversed. Marx Brothers' classic routine from 1933's Duck Soup. Harpo disguised as Groucho mimes every Groucho move face to face in open doorway. Vampires empty. Mourners draped. Self-portrait in a convex. Infinity effect dazzles me from the barber's chair, where I face my reflection reflected in the wall mirror behind me. Images and images, repeat, recede. Hollow. Step through the marvels of a logic and nightmare. Rear and side view for backing up or faring forward while checking for pursuit. My parents' goodbye waves as I returned to college. Cocaine dispenser. If broken, 7 years bad luck. Guidebook for magistrates. Hold up to nature for poets. Smoke and mirrors, we say. Mirage or miracle to admire. Deformed Richard III. Albeit charges for a looking glass that I may see my shadow as I pass. Either I'm more handsome than I thought, or noble women stupider and weak. Deposed Richard II. Command the mirror hither straight, that I may show me what a face I have, since it is bankrupt after majesty. I only know myself as rightful king. I can't imagine myself as less. And so, for selves and souls in time, both searching and unrecognized, may mirror neurons fire. So it is now my privilege to introduce Mark Pawlak, the author of 9 poetry collections and the editor of 6 anthologies, most recently Reconnaissance, new and selected poems, and poetic journals. My Deniversity, Knowing Denise Levertov, is his first prose book. For the past 40 years, Pawlak has been a co-editor of the Brooklyn, New York-based poetry journal and literary press Hanging Loose. To support his writing habits, he teaches math at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and Cambridge.
I know at least one professional dancer in the audience. Nice to meet you. So this was intended to be a book launch for my book, My Deniversity. This is the cover. Supply chain problems have prevented it from arriving. It's either on a dock somewhere, or the paper's floating around in the Pacific, or who knows what. But it'll be here in a couple of weeks. The Grolier has posted a link for ordering copies. And so anyway, these are my two most recent poetry collections, which we do have copies of. So, you may wonder why I teach mathematics. Well, my degree is in physics from MIT. I never intended to be a poet. But Denise Levertov intervened, and here I am. My Deniversity is perhaps a mysterious title for this book, but it's an ironic reference to Ezra Pound's term for the private tutoring he gave to New Directions publisher, who was Denise Levertov's publisher, William Carlos Williams' publisher, Ezra Pound's publisher, one of the great literary presses of all time in the modern era. And such poets as Basil Bunting and Louis Zukofsky also attended the Ezuversity, as Ezra Pound called his tutoring in Rapallo, Italy, over lunch or on hikes, or just whenever he paused in his various efforts and just dispensed his wisdom. So that was how poets came up and were trained in the Ezuversity. So I make reference to that here by borrowing that, adapting that title. I'll take my glasses off so I can read. So the book spans 3 decades, from when I first met Denise Levertov. She was a writer in residence at MIT. I was in my senior year. I was completing my degree in physics at MIT. And to say the least, she changed my life, and I became a poet. I concentrated in the memoir, even though it does span the 3 decades. My focus is on the years in the 1970s when she lived here in the Boston area. She lived here a little bit longer than that. She taught at MIT, she taught at Brandeis briefly, and she taught at Tufts University for a longer period of time. And I lived in close proximity. I was also working, teaching high school in the area, and had the occasion to pretty much just hang out with her. And so that was my Deniversity. Denise grew up, she's unusual, she grew up in suburban London. She was born in 1923. And her father was came from a Russian Hasidic family. He converted to Christianity and became a minister in the Church of England. Her mother was a Welsh school teacher. They met in Constantinople just before World War I and were married. And And so it's, she had an unusual background, and she grew up in a very, almost a Victorian kind of family setting where she was homeschooled. And basically they sat around at night and read great British literature and French literature and discussed philosophy and religion. That was sort of her background. As a young woman traveling in Europe after World War II, she met a GI from Brooklyn, Mitchell Goodman. They fell in love, we got married, and moved back to New York, and so she became an American poet. She had to adjust to, she was actually quite a budding poet with a first book already published in England in her early 20s before she came to the US. And she was actually, the word is that Kenneth Rexroth wrote her love letters and proposed to her before she came to the U.S. So she was kind of a hot topic at the time. I thought I'd start out by reading a poem of hers. Denise, a couple of years ago, the U.S. Postal Service published a sheet of 20 postal stamps with prominent American poets, and I think Denise was one of the only 2 women who were included in that postage. So she has her own postage stamp. New Directions. So I brought my old copies of all her books, which are just wonderful touchstones. I mean, there's now a collected poems, a selected poems, 2 biographies of her work in print. But I love these old books. So I thought I'd start with the title poem from this book from 1964, "Oh Taste and See." And this is one of her characteristic early poems. The world is not enough with us. Oh, taste and see, the subway Bible poster said, meaning the Lord, meaning, if anything, all that lives to the imagination's tongue. Grief, mercy, language, tangerine, weather, to breathe them, bite, savor, choose, swallow, transform into our flesh, our deaths. Crossing the street, plum, quince, living in the orchard, and being hungry and plucking the fruit. And I want to read a second poem from an even earlier book. I think this is her, The Jacob's Ladder, which was, I think, her first American publication. And this sort of refers to her family background, as I mentioned. This is called Illustrious Ancestors. The Rav of northern White Russia declined in his youth to learn the language of birds because the extraneous didn't interest him. Nevertheless, as he grew old, it was found he understood them anyway, having listened well, and it was said, prayed with the bench and the floor. He used what was at hand, as did Angel Jones of Mold, whose meditations were sewn into coats and breeches. Well, I would like to make thinking some lines still talk between me and them, poems direct as the birds said, hard as the floor, sound as a bench, mysterious as the silence when the tailor would pause with his needle in the air. Angel Mold was apparently a mystic Welsh tailor who was a descendant of, his mother descended from. So I'm going to read a section from the first chapter of the memoir about first encountering Denise Levertov. And this whole first chapter is called First Encounters of the Poetry Kind. In September 1969, my senior year at MIT, just before the start of the fall semester classes, I stood in the hallway outside Denise Levertov's office in Building 14 Killian Hall,
the humanities building where I'd gone to submit to an interview in the hopes of gaining admission to the writing workshop she would be offering. I had picked her class because of my budding interest in poetry and my curiosity about studying with a practicing artist. I didn't see myself as a poet then, nor did I aspire to become one. Rather, I expected to go on to graduate school, get a PhD, and pursue a career in experimental physics. I was feeling a bit anxious about encountering this exotic breed of person, the practicing poet. I had only just learned a year or two earlier that not all poets were dead white men. Also, I had never had to pass muster to gain admission to a class, and I was without a clue as to how to conduct myself. I announced my presence with a knock. "Mark Pawlak?" she inquired, stressing the first syllable, speaking with a distinctly British accent. "Yes? Come in, pull up a chair." And once I was seated, "Tell me about yourself." Ms. Levertov, call me Denise, sat behind the desk in an otherwise bare office where she had only recently taken up residence. A handful of books lay on a shelf on the wall behind her, giving the impression they had just been hurriedly unpacked. The office was bare of pictures or decorations of any kind. Her back was to the room's one window, which opened onto the grassy courtyard where Calder's sculpture, The Great Sail, loomed. She was dressed in a tight-fitting white jersey or sweater with horizontal black stripes, a dark color skirt, and striped stockings. Her black hair was cropped short. I noticed right off the distinctive gap between her upper front teeth. A sign of good fortune, she liked to tell people, I would learn later. And she was surrounded by a cloud of smoke. She chain smoked, exhaling as she talked. I was struck by her stature, small-boned, thin, almost petite, and by the sense of compressed energy like a coiled spring that she conveyed as she expounded. She didn't so much converse as dramatize what she was saying. Her face animated, her hands gesticulating. She fairly bristled with electricity. I was entirely unprepared for the kind of vitality she exuded, and a bit frightened by it. Here was a presence the likes of which I had never encountered. Barry Levine, another MIT student who was part of that same poetry class, told me years later, quote, "Back then Denise seemed more intense than any person I had ever met. It was a revelation, he said, that someone could have that kind of life energy. It changed the way I looked at the world, to realize it was possible to be that way." Sometime in April of 1969, the end of my junior year, I had asked my college roommate to help me in planning my final semesters of undergraduate study at MIT. Joe was a physics major too, but a year ahead of me. A mentor of sorts, he had offered me advice about many things, and now I wanted his help one last time before he took his diplomas and departed for graduate studies in England on a Marshall Fellowship. My remaining physics courses were prescribed, but I had room each semester to choose 2 electives. Outside physics, Joe and I shared a common interest in folk music and literature. He was an example to me of someone who, of how one could be serious about science and pursue art and literature as avocations too. A straight-A student, he also played guitar and performed in coffee houses, singing folk standards along with his own compilations. He wrote poetry too, served on the editorial board of the MIT's student literary magazine, The Tangent, and was studying playwriting with Lillian Hellman, then writer-in-residence. Joe knew that I wrote poems, having critiqued a few I had the temerity to share with him, and so he offered, "Why don't you just try to get into Denise Levertov's creative writing class? She'll be writer-in-residence next year." Until he made that suggestion, I had not taken my own poetry writing seriously enough to think about showing it to anyone other than him and my Boston University girlfriend. Least of all to a professional writer, a real poet. Until he mentioned her name, I had never heard of Denise Levertov. I had no idea what to expect when I penciled my name into the sign-up sheet in the humanities office for the interview. I had never met a real poet face-to-face. The closest I had come was when, with roommate Joe, I had attended a poetry reading by Allen Ginsberg to an overflow audience of hundreds at Harvard Sanders Theater the previous year. It had impressed me as more of a countercultural happening than an artistic performance. Ginsberg, wild hair and beard, playing a harmonium, chanting as much as reciting poems. Excepting Ginsberg, Corso, and Ferlinghetti, I had little exposure to contemporary poetry or poets. Of Levertov's work and reputation, I was entirely ignorant. In advance of the interview, Denise had requested that each applicant submit a sheaf of sample poems plus a brief written statement describing one's favorite poets and one's reasons for wishing to enroll in her workshop. I don't recall whether she asked me that day to read any of my poems that I had submitted, but I do remember that she plied me with questions asking me to elaborate on the statement that I had written. I see that you have a rather eclectic taste in English poets, she probed. Blake, Wordsworth, Yeats, Graves, Eliot. I confess that until very recently, my exposure to poetry was through reading standard high school anthologies. My interest in modern poetry, I explained, was sparked by 2 elective courses I had taken my junior year, one devoted to Yeats and the other to T.S. Eliot. Denise misconstrued the mention of Yeats and Eliot together as my thinking Eliot was an English poet. Growing up in London, she interjected, I thought Eliot was British too. It was only after I came to America that I started to read contemporary American poets that I learned he was born and grew up in St. Louis and that he attended Harvard. Offering this personal note helped put me at ease. Then I told her of my English major girlfriend who had read aloud to me poems by the British Romantics, Wordsworth, Byron, and Shelley, and by such 19th century American poets as Longfellow, Lowell, Emerson, Dickinson, and Poe. But I said I'd discovered Whitman on my own. Denise chuckled when I related the story of my summer job back home when I worked on the maintenance crew of the Cheektowaga Town Hall. Most afternoons, I told her, the regular employees who referred to themselves as lifers quit early and headed to the bar across the highway. I seldom joined them. Instead, I retired to the seclusion of the tool shed with a copy of Leaves of Grass, which I read cover to cover that summer in the sweltering afternoons. That same summer, I told her, I had also read Robert Frost's collected poems, sometimes with the book propped open on the steering wheel of the tractor as I mowed the town hall lawns at a leisurely pace. Good choices. But what made you pick those 2 poets in particular, she asked. Of all the poets we sampled in high school English, only Whitman stirred me. I wanted to find out more about him and read more of his poems. And Frost? I took out a Book of the Month Club subscription a few years ago, just to broaden my reading. It was one of the selections. At one point in the interview, Denise asked about my childhood. Where did you grow up? Buffalo, I answered, in which she crossed her arms and grasped her shoulders and shivered in the gesture of freezing from cold. Whenever I think of Buffalo, she said, I recall the bitter, bitter cold and the wind-whipped chest-deep snowdrifts. She told me she had once visited my hometown to give a poetry reading at the university. What she remembered of that experience was that her ears and nose had nearly become frostbitten while she tried to scurry between buildings. When the interview concluded, I retraced my steps through the battleship gray infinite corridor connecting one MIT building to the next and the next, passing large stainless steel canisters of liquid nitrogen and acetylene tubes that stood sentinel outside laboratory doors. Once outside again, amid the world of trees, grass, and sunlight, sailboats on the Charles River, joggers, strollers, loungers along the esplanade of auto and bus and truck traffic, I reviewed what had just taken place. Halfway across the Mass Ave bridge, spanning the river, heading back to my frat house in the Back Bay, I began to feel disheartened. Although Levertov had been personable and made every effort to put me at ease, I was convinced I had made a really poor impression. My reaction to that first encounter with Denise Levertov is ironic, given that I was in the daily presence of eminent scientists at MIT. More than once I had the occasion to discuss physics with Nobel Prize winners. They represented everything I aspired to become and more. To my mind, they were the epitome of scientific and philosophical thinking. But although in awe of them, I nevertheless did not feel tongue-tied the way I inexplicably did during this one brief face-to-face meeting with the poet, Denise Levertov. She appeared to me in a dream that night, first as Kali, the Hindu goddess of death and destruction, then as the hookah-smoking caterpillar in Alice in Wonderland, the animated Disney version, blowing smoke rings through the gap between her teeth as she interrogated me. Imagine my surprise then when a few days later I found my name included on the class list posted outside the Humanities building. Denise couldn't have seen much promise in the poems I had given her. They were juvenilia, love poems addressed to my girlfriend, written in a dreamy 19th century mode. Denise admitted as much to me a year or so later in a letter she sent me in response to a new batch of my poems. She remarked then at how far my work had come, adding, "And you started almost at zero." What had tipped the balance in favor of her admitting me to her poetry workshop was the lengthy term paper written for a contemporary literature course I had included along with the required submissions. This paper had earned me an A. In it, I had passionately argued in a comparison of Ginsberg's Howl and Walt Whitman's Song of Myself. And I discussed Ginsberg's debt to Whitman and compared Howl unfavorably to Song of Myself. I found your reading of the two poems very insightful, Denise told me. And your conclusion is right on the mark, she added. Much as I value Ginsberg's work, I agree with you that Whitman is the far greater poet. I looked forward to the start of her class, and with eager anticipation, I was curious about what it would be like to study with a working artist. So that's sort of the introduction. One or two more Levertov poems. So, this 1969-70, when I studied with her, was a very heady time to be living here in Cambridge. Her husband, Mitch Goodman, had been indicted in the first conspiracy trial, the famous Spock trial. So this was, preceded by many years, several years, the Chicago 7 trial for inciting young men to resist the draft. And they were both prominent anti-war activists. And in 1969, the Harvard strike happened across the street here. And then during my senior year, when I was studying with Levertov, MIT was just in complete, constant disruption. Protests by students. It was the focal point. We called MIT then the Pentagon on the Charles, because something like 80% of all research funding at MIT came from the Defense Department. And so there was a great effort to raise consciousness among faculty and students about this, the involvement with basically the war in Vietnam, directly or indirectly. And that had a big influence on me in changing my career in the future. So it was a pretty amazing time. And Denise, was also involved in all kinds of other activities. And whenever she read her poems, she always wanted to inform the audience about social issues, try to get them to join in anti-war activities, etc. And I guess the other important thing is that the end of that year, end of my senior year, was when the Cambodian invasion and the Kent State massacre, which closed all the universities. So I actually never had a graduation because everything was closed. And my 50th anniversary would have been during the COVID, and so I still didn't have a celebration of my completion. So I wanted to read a poem that she wrote at that time, right after the Kent State So she wrote many political poems. This is called The Day the Audience Walked Out on Me and Why. And it's dated May 8th, 1970 at Goucher College in Maryland, which I think at that time was an exclusively women's college and had not admitted men.
Yeah.
Like this had happened. After the antiphonal reading from the Psalms and the dance of lamentation before the altar, and the two poems, Life at War, these are her poems, and What They Were Like, I began my rap and said, yes, it is well that we have gathered in this chapel to remember the students shot at Kent State. But let us be sure we know our gathering is a mockery, unless we remember also the black student shot at Orangeburg 2 years ago and Fred Hampton murdered in his bed by the police only months ago. And while I spoke, girls, older women, a few men began to rise and turn their backs to the altar. And I went on and said, yes, it is well that we remember all these, but let us be sure we know it is a hypocrisy to think of them unless we make our actions their memorial, actions of militant resistance. And then the pews were almost empty. And I returned to my seat, and a man stood up in the back of the quaint chapel, in the back of the quiet chapel, near the wide open doors through which the green of May showed in the long shadows of late afternoon, and said my words desecrated a holy place. And a few days later, when some more students, black, were shot at Jackson, Mississippi, no one desecrated that white folks' chapel because no memorial service was held. Maybe I'll finish by reading one of my own poems. It occurred to me that this might be a good poem to finish on. There it is. I hope we'll have some time for questions and answers, but I've got some questions for you. This is called Do's and Don'ts. And it begins with an epigraph. Tony Bennett said it was Frank Sinatra who told him, steal from one person and it's plagiarism. Steal from everybody and it's research. So it's full of quotes. Keep a strict eye on eulogistic and dyslogistic adjectives. C.S. Lewis advised Kenneth Tynan. They should diagnose, not merely blame, and distinguish, not merely praise. Almost any noun is better than one chaperone, is better alone than chaperoned, if it is the right noun, and very few can stand two adjectives. Ezra Pound to Parker Tyler, 1935. Unsettled dream is stronger than unsettled white dream. Precision and economy of language are virtues to recommend when writing poems, but difficult to put into practice. It's more important, Ornette Coleman once said, to play the correct feeling than the correct note. Some of the time, to quote Chuck Close, you know you're cooking. The rest of the time, you just do it. Or as the Handbook on Improvisation for Church Organ advises, don't be afraid of being wrong, just be afraid of being uninteresting.
So let's open it up for a question and answer period. Does anyone have any questions?
Well, I wanted to ask DeWitt about the poems he wrote, which reminded me so much of Sweet Marjoram, the essays. So I was curious about how why you decided these were poems and those were essays, and what they look like on the page.
I'm still puzzling about that, the kind of quippy idea that actually Sweet Marjoram started with a prose poem, which was my first published poem, Constellations. And I hadn't written poetry for 50 years. I mean, I'm a prose writer, a novelist, a memoirs critic. But this just started to amuse me, I guess, and because it wasn't premeditated, and I didn't feel like I was with a spotlight on good manners. I could just be, gulp down a hamburger if I felt like it or whatever.
And you're having fun, you're enjoying yourself.
Absolutely. So, beginning with a piece called On Falling, which was a prose poem, I had a friend who was reading these things as my alpha reader, and he liked it. He encouraged me to keep it up. So I wanted to freak him out. I was looking for topics like privilege. That's a good hot one. That were difficult, but I also wanted to parody the hubris of internet omniscience. So the idea of running a topic to exhaustion, and instead of doing footnotes, I mean, I love that last piece that you just read with the floating quotations. It reminds me of David Markson, actually. But in fact, the internet was a great help, and Wikipedia was a great help. So when I came around to, I didn't know what I was going to write next. The hardest piece and the longest piece is called On Blood, and I'm interested in the metaphorical ground, and I'm interested in the metaphors. So the fact that on blood, you have to research, you have to think about the types of blood and the history of transfusion, and particularly in World War I and II, the advance of plasma that could be dehydrated and carried in little packets when you add water, that kind of thing. Also led to the more responsible concern about bloodlines, the medieval royal superstition about genetics, when we know that genetics are really in a helix and they have nothing to do with blood at all. The idea of mixed bloods, and obviously the Holocaust and the Nazi experiments with blood. And free associating around that until I ended up talking about my adopted son. So that took a long time. It took a lot of research and responsible imagining and thinking. But after I had done 33 of these, what was I going to do next? And I started to, the topics were still coming to me, but I was tired of using that kind of space. And I loved the white space around what presumes to be a poem. That silence, and also the contract with the reader that allows for emblematic moments. So it isn't just that a meditation that's a poem gets away with leaving a lot of things out. It's the fact that it's framed, and there's a willingness, the reader's willingness to think along, which is true of the essays too, but to get more involved in the drama of brevity. And I began to think that what is rhyme about anyway? And the tradition, I mean, I never took a poetry workshop. I'm a total amateur, except that I spent my life publishing poets and having poets for friends and reading poets, I suppose. But instead of
Device for
rhyme,
memory.
I think wit is this idea of gymnastic citation and parallels and surprising tangents is also poetry. But when I would send things out, the essays first would come back. Saying, well, it's not quite a lyrical essay, and it's certainly not, you know, the best American essay of the year. And the poems then would start coming back. And no one outright said, well, these are like essays. That's what's wrong with them. But I deliberately was ignoring rules.
But they're improvisations, in sort of the jazzy sense.
I'm glad to get that.
Yeah.
One of my favorite local poets is David Blair, his syncopation isn't simply the prosody of his poems. It's the velocity of wit, and that velocity of wit is something that the quickness that's a little ahead of the reader, you know, but you'll get it. You know, and maybe once you get into the rhythm of these disjunctions and, you know, what is it that's leading from X to Y, you may get ahead of the writer, but the writer's job is to make sure you don't. And so the basic idea of Robert Frost, of all people, of a poem writing on its own melody, starting in delight and ending with wisdom. Mine don't end with wisdom, they tend to end in bafflement.
Is there other questions?
Mark, just on this subject, you will remember, Mark and I, our hanging loose colleague, Bob Hirschon, who died a few months ago. Bob used to teach at a school in Brooklyn, and his high school students were forever pestering him by asking, well, what's the difference between prose and poetry? And Bob would always say, it's just not an important question, you know, to worry about. And that one day, Bob invited another poet friend of ours, Nathan Whiting, to come and read his poetry and address the class. And question and answer, and of course the first thing the kid said to Nathan was, well, what's the difference between prose and poetry? And Nathan thought for a second, he said, well, poets go to poets' parties, prose writers go to prose writers' parties.
They are two different tribes, for sure.
Any other questions?
Mark, how did your relationship with Denise change as you knew her for years?
Yeah.
So how would you describe its maturing or changing or?
So the kind of chapter structures I use, I talk about. Yeah, the table of contents. You know, it goes from initiation to apprenticeship to journeyman, and then sadly to estrangement when we sort of had a distancing later in our relationship. But so initially I was just curious and intrigued, and just kind of said to her, well, I want to learn from you. And she said, okay, let's do it. And and it was very informal. I had the good fortune of living in the vicinity, and when she was teaching at Tufts particularly, I could basically just drop into her house anytime I wanted and just hang out. I use her library. I read all the books on her shelves, and we'd have conversations about them.
Ah,
And I would talk to her about what I was, what was interesting to me, what books I was discovering, what poets I was discovering. And, often they were people whose work she already knew, but sometimes, my excitement would make her go back and, reread somebody she hadn't taken quite as seriously, and then, we'd have conversations about it. And then just the opportunity to sort of live, to be in the vicinity of someone who's a working artist and just kind of absorb how you work as an artist,
Yeah.
how you do that, how you function in the world, and reserve space for for that kind of inner dialogue you need to sustain your work. And she was very jealous of her private space in a certain sense, even though she was also at the same time very generous with young writers. I wasn't the only person that she was really sharing and encouraging and reading our work and commenting on it, etc. She when I had sort of evolved to a point where she felt I'd really found my voice and was ready, was really publishing books, publishing enough poems to publish a book of my own. She helped me find a publisher, introduced my first book, and she actually, I think to the consternation of some of the colleges that invited her to read. She was a very prominent figure in those days, and was invited to read all the time, and commanded reasonable fees. And she would bring me and a couple other at least one other poet I knew along. Tino would probably have this opportunity as well. Tino Villanueva. And she would bring it. She'd show up to do the reading that she was invited to do, and she'd bring us as well, and we'd read with her. Actually, my first reading with her was at UMass Boston, in this big, huge auditorium. It's Presby Auditorium, 600 people, full audience. And she said, "Well, now I want to introduce you to this exciting new poet." And I read, for 10 or 15 minutes my own poems. She was really a real promoter of people. A variety of people. Maybe Tina might want to talk about that. And so she was really generous in many ways. And it was kind of interesting kind of dichotomy, because on the one hand she was really private, really preserving her own space, but at the same time she was being generous with younger writers that she admired. And she would people wrote her, young writers would send her poems, and if she liked them, she would save them and put them in a drawer. And then if some editor came along and said, hey, I'm starting a new magazine, or I'm doing something, and I'm looking for some new exciting writers. Do you know any? And she'd pull them out and she'd send them off and say, yeah, take a look at these. And Dick can say, Hanging Loose. There was a couple of occasions. Hanging Loose magazine gave Denise, like 10 or 20 pages to kind of have a supplement of the issue, which she selected the poems, and she would select young writers who she was discovering, and she would write an introduction and present their work in this mini anthology.
And actually, also, Hanging Loose got started in her the first workshop that she ever taught in '64, when I met Emmett Jarrett, and he introduced me to Ron Schreiber. That's how we got started. It was through Denise.
Yeah.
Through Denise.
She was a contributing editor for
Yeah,
25 years.
Yeah.
But then, but she could be very opinionated, to say the least, and sometimes crankily so. So in her first really wonderful collection of essays called Poet in the World, which I highly recommend. There's nothing like it. But one of the first pieces is called an admonition. And it's a brief scolding to the first editors of Hanging Loose magazine,
about their interpretation of William Carlos Williams' idea of no ideas but in things. And so even though here she is, they're mentoring them, being a contributing editor to the magazine, but she's scolding them at the same time. So that was typical of Denise. And I try to address in the last section. So there's also, I should say, there's a lot of in the book about her relationship with her husband, Mitch Goodman, in both good times and they eventually divorced and separated. But they spent a lot of time in a little farmhouse in Temple, Maine that they had, which was kind of their retreat from the city. And I had the good fortune to be an invited guest there, one summer, as well as one winter when she had just returned from, in 1973, she and Muriel Rookheiser and Jane Hart, who was the wife of one of the senators from Colorado, they were all anti-war activists. They went to Hanoi in 1973.
Wow.
Yeah, and toured North Vietnam, and came back and did talks and poetry readings, and Denise actually brought back a whole series of silk screens that were done in a workshop in Hanoi by artists in Hanoi, and we reprinted them here and used them as a fundraising to raise money for the Bach Mai Hospital back in North Vietnam, which had been damaged by U.S. bombers. So she, I was there in the winter during the middle of the infamous Christmas bombing when Nixon and Kissinger bombed North Vietnam to try to bring them to the table for negotiations to end the war. And it was just a really brutal, cruel bombing. And she was just distraught being trapped in Maine in the middle of a snowstorm, unable to travel to Washington and protest and lock herself against the gates of the Pentagon or something. So it was very, so all that kind of stuff is in the book. But toward the end, we kind of parted ways in terms of our aesthetics of poetry, and some of it mysterious to me, and I try to address that and understand it, and look at other writers whose work she had admired early on and championed early on, who she distanced herself from later in life. So she went through a lot of change. She started out, so there was always a degree of spirituality in her work. Later in life, she converted to Catholicism, and wrote a libretto for a mass as one of her poems. And then last year there was an almost Buddhist-like quality to nature poems she was writing when she moved to Seattle later in her life. So I guess we both went through a lot of changes.
Yeah.
And grew distant toward the end. So I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, I don't know.
So it was a real trajectory, and I try to portray that in the book.
No, in your title, the Deniversity, right? The idea that it's a over time, and that it has depth, and that's fabulous. Thank you for that long answer.
Tito.
Mark, which was that reading where, maybe you alluded to it already, where she either quoted or read your poems, or you read along with her, the recording of which is across the street.
Oh, yeah.
In the Woodbury Poetry Room.
Yeah, that was, that's a funny, so she, and I make a certain reference to it in the memoir as well. So she was invited, there was a reading at the Harvard Divinity School. And she was invited to read, and there was this academic poetry scholar who also gave a talk, and I remember he talked about how poorly we treat our poets in America. And Denise, being the contrarian that she always was, she got up and said, well, I have to first start off and say I totally disagree with him. You know, we're really lucky to be, you know, to be able to express our feelings, you know, and it's really the people who don't have that ability, that capacity to express themselves and the opportunity who are the people to be really about, and not us poets, you know, so I don't take that. And then, yeah, then she was, it was a talk in which she talked about different kinds of poetry, which she defined as plain poetry, which is very straightforward and lacking in metaphor, and poetry she considered deeper and more resonant. And I was in the audience, and then she decided, she said, and I want to give you an example, and she read one of my poems. I was like,
That was an example of what?
an example of, you know, the deeper, more resonant metaphorical
yeah.
poetry. And I said, oh, so that's what I'm doing. So it was, yeah, so yeah, it was, it's an interesting talk. It's recorded, yes, in the Woodbury Poetry Room, the Vocarium there. There's a recording of the whole talk, of the whole reading. It's fascinating. She also talks a lot, so she was controversial. She, at that same reading, she talked about why she was not in favor of women's poetry. She said, you know, well, first of all, I've never been discriminated against as a woman. I've never felt that, that my gender had any effect on my ability to write and publish my work. Which you know, I mean, she was one of the few poets in the major anthologies, women poets, that came out at that time. There was one anthology of British and American poets that came out in the late 50s, and she was the only woman. And then the famous avant-garde anthology, The New American Poetry, that came out in 1960, in which Robert Creeley and Robert Duncan and Ginsberg and the New York School and San Francisco Renaissance, all those avant-garde poets were published. You know, she was one of 2 or 3 women included as well. So she was very privileged in a certain sense, but she always felt that she deserved it. So it had nothing to do with her gender. And her critique of women's, the women's movement was just kind of exploding at that time in the early, late 60s or the 70s, and and her critique was that if you write for an audience, that you're limiting the poem. The poem needs to have the freedom to explore its dimensions on its own. And if you really know what you want to say, then you're writing poor, bad poetry. That was her argument. She had the same feeling about children, adults who write poetry for children. She said, well, they write verse, and she said, and intelligent children will recognize that it's not real poetry.
Oh, that's great.
I didn't want this to be a hagiography, this book, and so I really try to present all of her contradictions, some of which of her strong opinions I agreed with, and some I didn't, and some I just didn't understand, and try to parse why, what she was really trying to say, and why. Yeah. So that's all kind of stuffed in there.
How have you passed it on?
How
have you passed it on?
Have I passed it on? Well, I guess through editing Hanging Loose, largely, and through, I've had the good fortune of having some wonderful interns from the MFA program at UMass Boston, where I teach, work with me on Hanging Loose and sharing what I know about, what I've learned from her and what I know about poetry with them. One year, I had 2 MFA students
who were actually working in my tutoring center when I taught at UMass Boston. And I asked them what they were reading, what in their classes. And I said, I just thought it was, I thought it was an extremely narrow selection of kind of classic post-war American poetry. It wasn't very adventurous. I said, well, what about Robert Greeley and Denise Levertov? Do you guys have they ever talked about it in your classes? And I said, no, never heard about them. So I started a seminar, an informal seminar with these two young men. And I said, okay, well, are you interested? Let's meet once a week and we'll read all of Greeley and Levertov. I'll select stuff and we'll read their poems and talk about them. And that was a wonderful experience for me, but also a way of passing on, I think. And I know they remember very fondly that informal seminar we did. And I'd love to do more of that. Yeah. I want to do the objectives next. If anybody's interested, call me up. Doing that online seminar. Any other questions? Well, thank you all.
I just have to ask, I'm struck by your own transition from someone on a path to a PhD in physics to suddenly meeting this woman who's so powerful and extraordinarily energetic and everything that you described that she is. And did you just know then that you were pointing yourself differently, or was that a long coming to terms with?
It was it took a long time, yeah. No, I mean, initially, she was certainly an influence, being such a strong and vocal anti-war activist. And what was going on at MIT at that time, I decided that it would be very difficult for me to really pursue my PhD and not in some way be implicated in researching and developing weapons, directly or indirectly. It's really, I was right about that. I mean, I was actually working on high-powered lasers, which some years later the Reagan Star Wars initiative adopted that technology to supposedly shoot down missiles out of the sky. And so I made a conscious decision that I wasn't going to pursue. So I turned down my fellowship for the PhD. I had no idea what I was going to do. I was at a loss. This had been my whole path up to this point. And so I think I was deeply depressed and totally confused and took a lot of drugs. I happened to run into a former professor of mine from MIT who was starting a free school in California. And he said, "What are you doing, Mark?" And I said, "Well, actually, I have no idea what I'm doing with my life." And he said, "Want to come to California with us next week?" I said, "Sure, I have nothing else to do." And that's how I became a teacher. On a total whim. He indoctrinated me on the cross-country car ride to California into the idea of the free school movement. I taught in Santa Barbara for a year. Came back to Cambridge. Santa Barbara was nice, but if you grow up in Buffalo and live in cities, dirty, smelly industrial cities, paradise is hard to adjust to.
What was your draft status?
I was fortunate not to. My number was high enough, so. But I was intent on not going regardless. And then I came back to Cambridge, and I fell in with a group of people who were starting an alternative high school here in Cambridge. And we started what was called the group school. It was a school for local Cambridge kids who were dropouts, disaffected, basically, high school students. And we invented the school in which the students and the faculty together ran the school. It was a totally democratically run school.
which meant that, every decision took about, 4 days of constant arguing. It wasn't the most efficient way of doing things, but it was really a wonderful experience, and those students are lifelong friends of mine. They're now in their 50s and 60s, and we're still in touch. And they've sent their children to me at UMass Boston. I've taught their children. And, so that was how I became a teacher. And then when the group school started to kind of founder, I was offered a position at UMass Boston, which in those early days seemed to me just kind of the adult version of the group school. Because most of the students, it was a commuter school entirely in those days. And the students were largely working class, people from the inner city who often had not gone to college right out of high school. Many of them were vets, but many were not, and people who worked in the workforce, and then decided that they'd go back to school, and so they were working and going to school. And they were just the most motivated people I'd ever met. It was really inspiring. It was really an exciting place to teach. So that's how and all along I was eking out the poems.
Well, we were also changing generations in the mid-60s, and the Cambridge and the Grolier world that I first stumbled into has been pretty well described by Kathleen Spivak in her book about the Lowell Circle.
Right.
But it tended to be these scions of poetry that were also relating to the Hope Mifflin Company and to the Atlantic Monthly and to what we call the establishment. And then into this comes this sort of mid-60s, early 70s group of disruptors. and also noisemakers that coming from different factions of the poetry world or the fiction world, never thought of combining forces. They were sectarian, and they were quick to dismiss the other on ideological or ascetic terms, without understanding that they were mutually outcasts. And that's what Ploughshares, happened into, and then Plough and the Stars up the street 50 years ago. That by combining forces, that we all are trying to create a literary situation, a literary community, a world where aspirations are respected.
Indeed, and of course, it's often referred to as in the publishing as the mimeograph revolution, because literally in the 60s, the means of producing poetry magazines and books suddenly became available to everybody. Hanging Loose literally started out as a mimeographed sheets that were stuffed inside an envelope, so it hung loose. That's where the title came from. There was art on the cover. I should bring it up. I have many of the original issues, and there was a recent exhibit a book put together in Brooklyn Public Library, Brooklyn Museum, about all the proliferation of literary magazines and presses in the New York area during the late 60s. Hundreds of them. Many of them lasted 2 issues, and folded, and others, Hanging Loose is rare. So Hanging Loose we're still going. Dick, as one of the last founding editor, started in 1966, and Hanging Loose is still going. We're about to publish our 112th issue. I've only been doing it 40 years. So,
Wow.
Dick and the other editors called me the kid. I've only been doing it 40 years.
Junior editor.
Junior.
But now I'm junior, junior. So, but yes, there was just this opportunity, you know, to,
Huh.
down the street here, I don't know if the Democracy Center is still open, but there was a period where they had, they rented out space to various community organizations, and I walked in there one day, and one of them was a zine library. And there you go with me. We walked in and I said,
Oh, library.
this, yeah, and you know, these were like mimeographed zines, you know.
But they were new.
They were new, they were
Sort of a new wave.
it was a new wave. I walked in and said, oh my God, we invented this. And it's still going, and there's another iteration of it, you know.
Well, there seems to be a movement now among town libraries to have collections of zines.
Really, yes.
There was one out in Watertown, but they seem to be an outlet for 20-somethings
Yeah.
who are interested in book design, dissidence, identity politics, and trying to make trouble. And I think that's a great combination.
Well, you know, there used to be a bookstore, you may remember this, in Central Square called 100 Flowers. You know, which one was, you know, let 100 flowers blossom. You know, 100
That was in, where was it? Inman Square, wasn't it?
Was it
Oh, no.
I think it was Central
Oh,
Square.
no, I'm thinking of that other one that was in Inman Square.
Yeah,
The
It's
women's
Chairman
book.
Mao's.
Yeah, Chairman Mao,
motto.
yeah. That was a Maoist idea,
Yeah.
let 100 ideas flower.
Mhm.
And so that was really very much the spirit of those times. And there, you know, there was a bookstore at every corner. There was a bar and a bookstore at every
I
corner.
remember 13 bookstores in
Yeah.
the 1970s that would take books on consignment.
For the early years of the group school, it was based in the basement of the Harvard Epworth Church here around the corner. And on my lunch hour, I could hit every bookstore in Harvard Square, and I knew the shelves so well that I could tell them a new title. I was only looking at the poetry books, but I could tell when the new title was on the shelf. So, you know, so in a half an hour, I could find all the new books that had showed up in the last week. You know? And now, you know, they're now Reading International in the corner is
Did you have any commerce with Temple Bar Bookstore?
yes, a number of books, you know, and Harvard professors would sell collections and get really wonderful collections of hardcover classic, you know, my complete Rilke letters. I got it one of the, I don't remember the name of the bookstore, it was just a couple of doors down here on Mass Ave. They were Ezra Pound Cantos I bought there as a used copy and a hardbound copy for a wonderful resource. So it's very, there's the Raven bookstore now in the basement of the Harvard bookstore, but that's about it in this area. Raven used books. So yeah, it was a rich time with lots of ideas flowing and lots of opportunities to explore oneself. Life and find community, and I think, you know, the other piece was community. That people, you know, sought community, sought commonalities of ideas, and supported one another in pursuing their ideas. It was a big time.
Thank you.
Thank
Wow.
Hopefully the ship will dock soon and my book will be.